Before I start the ramble that follows, let's begin with a disclaimer. This video essay is not a nation versus nation thing. So if you take it as such, then take a step back and just examine your own national protectionist biases. Second, these are my own lived experiences and observations based on them. So your own experiences may differ and the actual truth may be different again. There's a lot of subjectivity going on here, so take it as you will. Now, I was born in the August of 1970, a year after humans first walked on the moon, and the glorified cap to the 1960s that was Woodstock had taken place. Followed months later by Altamont, which provided the final nail in the coffin. Lennon had staged his bed in, the Beatles had performed live for the last time on a rooftop in Apple Records. In aviation, the 747 flew its first commercial flight, and Concorde took its first flight test. Judy Garland and Brian Jones had died, and the Avengers, not that one, took its final series, and that is before becoming the new in 1975. And the UK abolished the death penalty. So there's that. It was also the year in which the first edition of WRG's Ancient Rules was released. The year after my birth, 1971, an American by the name of Gary Gygax released a medieval war game known as Chainmail. And we'll get to that. Now, I grew up on the edge of a village right next to a playing field, in a swathe of actual fields and a lightning-blasted tree and a mill pond. The infant school that I attended was just up the road, and I can remember snow so thick that we built an igloo in the playing field. Yes, we went to school when it snowed. Not too far away was the Grand Union Canal, one of Britain's old arteries, cut in by a relatively famous river in the annals of England. I saw my first live magician at a children's party held in a pub just on the banks of that canal. Picturesque and flat Middle England. My family, however, were from Yorkshire. With working parents, it was quite common for my sister and myself to spend a fair amount of time during school holidays and so on up there. Becoming a scout gave me a general love of the outdoors, and roaming around the wilder, hillier, more evocative corners of North Yorkshire fused the outdoors to my soul. I read a lot. Even to the point of one of my junior school teachers allowing me to read instead of the activity that the rest of the class were engaging in at the time. I read the Chronicles of Prydain, which you may know, the Black Cauldron. I read the Chronicles of Narnia, of which you'll probably know The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. Alice and her adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass. Treasure Island, Robin Hood, King Arthur, the Mabinogion, Tarka the Otter, White Fang, The Secret Garden, many, many, many more. During this time, WRG continued to update their rules. And a little game developed out of Chainmail in 1974 called Dungeons and Dragons. I was 3 or 4 when it was published, and 9 by the time that I knew it existed. But don't for a second think that it's all fantasy for this young boy. In fact, with Patrick Moore as a guide on television and in books, I had grown to love stars and planets and space in general. My father's bookshelf was, as it happens, full of Heinlein, Asimov, Doc Smith, Dixon and others. I consume science fiction as much, if not more, than fantasy. And that was even further fueled by said father taking me to London to see Star Wars in a quadraphonic cinema in Leicester Square in 1977. There you heard the Tantive 4 fly past overhead before it appeared on the screen, shortly followed by a menacing rumble of the pursuing Star Destroyer as it did the same for what seemed like an eternity of stunned jaw-dropping. So here we are in this nostalgia trip in Christmas of 1978. I had been given copies of the Sword of Shannara and the Lord of the Rings, and my head was already swimming with the fantastic legends of the Yorkshire Dales and Moors. That summer, in a newsagent in Scarborough, I picked up my first issue of the comic 2000 AD and persuaded my father to take out a subscription to it, because I think he secretly wanted to read it too. And that winter I picked up a copy of a magazine with a spaceship flying over what looked like a castle built on an asteroid or something. White Dwarf, issue number 10. In here I found a bunch of adverts that I largely ignored, a game called Light Sword that invoked the lightsaber duels of Star Wars, Chapter 3 of a story, The Valley of Four Winds, and Part 2 of an article named The Experienced Traveller. That referenced some mysterious books. Oh, and some statistics for monsters from some fantasy game or other that were fun to read, but not as engaging as the aforementioned article. So I tracked down back issues. I actually read some of the articles. I sent 30 pence worth of stamps and a stamped addressed envelope off to a company called Games Workshop for their illustrated games catalogue, featuring details of White Dwarf magazine. Boldly advertised under the heading New to Fantasy Gaming, I found, both in the newsagents and in back issues from Games Workshop, the previous 9 issues of White Dwarf, and promptly dedicated part of my pocket money to future issues. And with some Christmas money, I ordered from the illustrated game catalogue a box containing those mysterious books the Experienced Traveller game was referencing. That was the start of my gaming, with the science fiction role-playing game Traveller. In the interests of starting the conversation that the title of this piece is meant to hold on, this is where the journey and observation begins. From the adverts in the pages of White Dwarf, you would be led to believe that the shop stocking games such as Traveller were all over the place in the UK. And this simply wasn't true. There were quite a few, mostly dealing on a mail order basis, with those that actually had physical shops resembling arcane libraries. Now, this may well have been the same in the US, but reading articles from US magazines such as Dragon, and even the inclusion of Dungeons and Dragons in movies such as E.T., seemed to suggest that it was otherwise over there. Another difference seemed to be age. Convention reports in the pages of White Dwarf showed mainly people at least 10 years older than me, and the aforementioned appearance in E.T. aside, it seemed similar in the US, but there was more of a sense, perhaps misplaced, that the role-playing crowd in the US were of a younger demographic than within the UK, at least back then, in the late 1970s and early 1980s. There's also seemed to be less direct association with wargaming. Here, RPGs were sold alongside wargames and wargaming paraphernalia. In the US, this was true, except that RPGs, some of them at least, had found their way into bookshops and toy stores and so on. A little further down the road, and I did eventually get introduced to Dungeons and Dragons, this began in a field near Silverstone of Grand Prix frame, in discussion with an old friend regarding this newish phenomenon of role-playing games. Eventually, that led to playing through my first ever adventure, which happened to be Palace of the Silver Princess, with another friend, and taking part in one session of a US Air Force employee from a nearby bases game, which was sort of fun, but there was an element of taking himself a little too seriously. He did, however, have a miniature of a Jabberwocky after Tenniel's art, and if I wasn't into the game at the start, then my love for Alice and the appearance of that miniature cemented things. By this time, 2 nearby toy shops had started to stock gaming material. A shelf about 3 feet long and 5 feet tall in Taylor and McKenna held miniatures from Grenadier and Ralpatha, along with a small handful of role-playing games, mainly Dungeons and Dragons. A space at the back of a toy shop owned by a furniture company stocked a few more odds and sods, including a broad selection from Judges Guild and Dragon magazine. And as time went on, more mainstream places opened their doors to role-playing and associated games. These included computer game shops, which dedicated part of their shelf space to Battletech, a game I came into on the ground floor from an interest in military vehicles and science fiction. At that time, I had no idea what anime was, let alone mecha as an anime genre. I can never recall Robotech being on UK television, but we did have Ulysses 31 and Battle of the Planets, both of which I discovered very much later that were based on Japanese anime shows. During this period, and let's call it the first edition era, I started going to conventions. Now, I already had an idea of what a convention was from the pages of Dragon and White Dwarf, and I found that they were actually nothing like that at all. In the UK, until Gen Con became a thing and took over holiday camps for long weekends, most conventions were in community halls and the like. The photos in White Dwarf were seemingly staged to make things look larger than they actually were. And the TSR castle shown in the pages of Dragon from reports on Gen Con US were nowhere to be seen. And still, the greatest representation of role players were also wargamers. Again, my understanding was that the US, while Dungeons and Dragons and other role-playing games originated from within the wargaming community, they were played more by young people, particularly students, who were forming effectively the first generation of role-playing gamers. That, as opposed to wargamers who received role-playing games as an extension to the wargame hobby. In fact, in some ways, that was a generational cusp that my peers and I sat on. Some of us were wargamers, all of us were role players at that time, and in those halcyon school days, very few of us had feet in both camps, and in the main, my role-playing friends were a very different group from my wargaming friends, with a very small crossover. During the 1980s, most of my role-playing was with first edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. It was difficult to find players for much else, perhaps on par with basic Dungeons and Dragons, but little else. Games that we played that weren't D&D were usually engaged as one-offs, a traditional Halloween Call of Cthulhu session, for example. So again, along with promising myself playing time at conventions to give myself a break from refereeing, I also was promising myself game time to try out different games, whether I knew them or not. Most of my forays into cyberpunk came from the cyberpunk game from Artel Saurian, came from refereeing tournaments. It's also through the 1980s that I became interested in rules and rule concepts. That led me to check out toolkit games such as Rollmaster, and to explore games that had gained some traction in the UK, but that our gaming groups weren't particularly trying out so much. RuneQuest, for example, which my cousin Tim introduced me to. The mid-1980s on saw role-playing games get somewhat more of a commercially viable thing, driven largely by Games Workshop and the establishments and more direct promotion within the UK market that TSR UK did. Role-playing games became a thing, or at least more of a thing that people could get into without hunting down backstreet pokey shops. The Virgin Game Store was a glossy affair that arrived in 1984 on Oxford Street in London, big retail centre. Breaking out of the games sold by game companies and into mainstream retail. Forbidden Planet, a store chain that to this day focuses on the nerds among us, introduced role-playing into its inventory. Role-playing games became more and more available as the 1990s approached, turning up in record shop chains, computer game stores, toy shops, and even bookshops. Even Hamley's giant toy shop in London that served as an occasional treat destination stocked some materials amongst the teddy bears, which I was moderately surprised to see one day in 1987 on picking up a copy of The Best of Dragon Volume 5. Heading into the 1990s, things exploded. Not literally, but from the initial struggles to find anything, things went in a wholly different direction. This was now the era of 2nd edition Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, and role-playing was really starting to take flight. TSR UK used to release a catalogue at the beginning of the year, outlining all of the intended releases, and I used to pre-order everything that I wanted for it to show up in bundles as the year went on. For other games, even the more obscure rules could be found in a multitude of places. Often, it was impossible to keep up with everything, swamped with choices. The convention scene became glossier too, with Gen Con arriving in 1990 at Camber Sands. This would run there annually until 1995, and then shifted to Leicester for a few years. The last time I refereed at a convention was Gen Con UK 2000 in Manchester, where I ran an introductory event for the 3rd edition Dungeons & Dragons. But something wasn't right. Either I'd grown out of them, or they just weren't the events that I loved anymore. In any case, the final one I attended was at Olympia 2 in London in 2001, and, well, it was not to my taste. Anyway, that's jumping ahead. The 1990s was my heaviest period of role-playing, outside of our family and friends games. Refereeing took me to Germany, the US, and various points in the UK. This was a fun time, and the role-playing scene felt very much like a community. But it was also, at least as we passed the midpoint of the decade and entered into, shall we say, the Magic the Gathering era, that a lot of gatekeeping started to appear. During the early days of 2nd edition, there were some mumblings of anti-change, but not very much. Perhaps because Facebook wasn't a thing back then. Conventions ran tournaments for 1st, 2nd, basic, concurrently, without any issues. But I think that the peak of that was around 1995. After this point, there was a tangible commercial feel to things. I mean, they've always been at least partially about shifting product. But I think the last one that felt like it had a balance between the commercial and the fun side of gaming was that 1995 conventions. For me, conventions and tournaments were about getting people into games, but when talk began about tournament materials requiring reference to several source books, in this case the ever-expanding PHBR series, that began to feel more like materials were being pushed than gamers being included. Of course, history has shown us that TSR and a number of other companies were going through the mill at that time, or had even already closed up shop. By 1997, Wizards of the Coast owned Dungeons and Dragons, and by 1999, Hasbro had bought Wizards. The commercialization was, for me at least, tangible. During the late 1990s and early 2000s, I was working freelance on various things. The joke was, when asked what I did for a living, the answer was, anything you can pay me for. I did some time as a data analyst, a programmer, technical author, a number of other odd jobs. I had a handful of articles published in Dragon and Dungeon magazines that gave me some inroad into working with Pro Fantasy, the makers of Campaign Cartographer, on their Forgotten Realms Atlas project, in concert with Wizards of the Coast. Through the Dragon articles, I found myself signing an NDA for playtesting 3rd edition, and got to see the evolution of that particular game as it went through the various phases. With Pro Fantasy, I also got, well, let's say, to hang out with the stars, even though I've never been much of a fan of the cult of personality. At Gen Con UK and Gen Con US, forging some connections with the likes of Mark Miller, Lauren Wiseman and Ed Greenwood. Perhaps the highlight for me was a brief bit of downtime, chewing the fat with Gary Gygax, while both of us were having a smoke break. For the record, I haven't smoked now for 11 years and counting. All of these experiences shifted me once again into a different mode of role-playing scene, more into the realms of the rules themselves, the maths and the trappings, rather than the games. It was perhaps the most productively creative time for me. In the home again, though, things were very slow. While I was enthusiastic about 3rd edition and my group had participated in playtesting it, the system never really stuck with others around the table. We actually played more non-D&D games at that point, Traveller, Vampire and Call of Cthulhu especially, and than D&D itself. 4th edition passed by. I bought the rulebooks, I read them, I didn't do anything with them, except sell them on eBay some years later. The game had evolved into an overly complex skirmish game, rather than the role-playing game that its contemporaries were doing a better job at. I felt that this diminishing interest in D&D began with the advent of the D20 license. This opened up things to a greater scale and greater accessibility for third-party publishers, for amateur publishers and so on, but it also gave rise to the publication of so much crap. It was impossible to keep up with the good stuff. The market was, and still is, utterly swamped. But then D&D Next arrived, and with it came an open invitation to playtest, which I took up and actually thoroughly enjoyed the process. A good chunk of the playtesting comprised running old modules with the new rules and reporting back on how easy or hard it was to do. See, part of the remit for 5th edition was to be an easy-to-use set of rules that could be made to work with anything. I mean, it's grown since then, but the fact that I could grab out one of my 1st edition modules and run it with 5th edition straight off the bat, more or less, hugely appealed. Now try doing that with 3rd edition. And so we arrive at the present day. 5th edition is the current incumbent. Whatever you think about, whatever politics you think is sitting behind certain aspects of certain game companies, role-playing is an absolute mainstream hobby enjoyed by millions around the world now. I've seen it grow and evolve and have even had the pleasure and privilege to be a small part of that process. With Vox Machina, we now have D&D on mainstream TV. Cthulhu is everywhere, and if you think the game has nothing to do with that, you're mistaken. Traveller is going through a small renaissance under the guiding hand of Mongoose. RuneQuest is there with a strongly effective 7th edition. There are lots of new and exciting game mechanics turning out in lots of new games. There's still a lot of crap about in the open game and license front. Hamleys don't stock role-playing games anymore. But regardless, we live in a time where people know what you're talking about when you mention role-playing. And many people can relate to the conversation, whether by playing themselves or that they are familiar with the concepts from YouTube shows and the like. The hobby isn't a backstreet hidden shop anymore. But I recognise that a lot of people still wish it was. I started this piece with the intention of writing about the differences between the UK and the US with respect to role-playing gaming, and I'm conscious of the fact that I've witted on a lot about my own history within the genre, so let's spend a short time bringing back things onto that track. First, we have to ask whether there is a difference, to which I say yes, there is. From my own perspective, this difference runs to several factors, and you'll see why all of the preceding stuff was necessary to understand them. First, availability. Role-playing games, at least as we understand them today, and regardless of being able to conveniently buy things in PDF, books much better. They have their origins in the US, and they have traditionally remained a US concern. Most of the major RPG companies are American, a notable exception being Mongoose, who published the current edition of Traveller and who began their publishing career under the D20 license for 3rd edition D&D. It is understandable then that the US has always had and remains to have better availability for role-playing game materials than the UK and other parts of the world. Second, influences. In the UK, our fantasy is more often than not aimed at children. This applies to The Hobbit, Harry Potter, The Worst Witch, Narnia, Alice, the whole shebang. In the US, the primary influences are of more adult nature. Howard, Lieber, Anderson and the like. There's obviously a crossover in what we consume, but I'm more talking about what is prevalent that influenced us in a broader sense. Not necessarily directly reading things, but things that are present in the background that shape the environment. I think this leads to UK game designers to be more story orientated and US designers to be more to work more in an episodic view. Compare Howard's Conan stories, which were often quite short and to the point, with the sprawl of Lord of the Rings and Gormenghast. Similarly, compare first edition adventures from the US, such as the G, D, Q, T, A and I series, to the U and UK series, and to B10, Night's Dark Terror, a UK entry into the B series. The comparison shows us US authors tending towards shorter, contained scenarios that occasionally, but independently, progress, while the UK authors trend towards longer affairs, at least in scope, if not in page length, with a more definitive plot. Authors also tend to ground themselves in their environment. I don't believe a US author could have arrived at something so evocative of the Mabinogion and Monty Python as I Ate, Ravager of Time. And nor do I believe that a UK author could have arrived at a source book such as Gaz 14, the Etruscan clans. We simply don't have the same frames of reference. There's also a sense of wrongness when we do try, and for want of a better term, step into each other's territories. I'm not justifying this sense, and I think it's misplaced, more often than not. But, for example, the entire HR series of historical reference books for second edition AD&D read like the authors missed the point, which perhaps isn't a fair assessment, but things take a different light when you can spend a fair chunk of your lifetime living reasonably close to locations such as where Paulinus finally defeated Boudica and where the Battle of Naseby heralded the beginning of the end for the English Civil War, where artefacts in the Viking Age turn up while we're digging over our vegetable plots, and Sutton Hoo isn't a bad place to revel in history over a cuppa in the visitor centre. And that cuts both ways. There's nothing intrinsically wrong with a UK author waxing lyrical on the American Civil War or the Indian Wars or the expansion of the United States into the West or any other significant historical event of continental America. What is lacking is lived and breathed empathy for the subject, and it often shows when fiction and game authors touch on these subjects. Shared experiences also often go awry. Take World War II, arguably the most harrowing shared experience the UK and US have had. There is an obvious national bias there, often ignoring the facts in the face of what people have been brought up to believe through that bias. Take the movie U-571, for example. If it were believed, and for the record, the movie makes it absolutely no claim of historical accuracy itself, then the capture of Enigma, a major turning point in the war, was a US achievement, when in fact the British Royal Navy did this before the US had entered the war. There is also the perennial, if it wasn't for the US, the Brits would be speaking German perspective, forwarded by many Americans, when the truth is much greyer, and is probably more accurately represented by if the US, UK and Russia had not figured out a way to work together as allies, more of the world would be speaking German or Japanese than it is today. Of course, most of that is Hollywood bias there to sell domestic tickets. Which sort of brings me to my final point in this. The US and UK share a strong influence on each other, right from the get-go. Wars aside, we share a common language, and that has enabled us to share music, literature, ideas, technology, and yes, games, to a greater extent than any other nations on the planet. That alone has ensured that we, in my opinion, have a net positive influence on each other. What differences do exist between us adds that extra spice which keeps things interesting. Whatever the politicians say the special relationship between our two great nations is or is not, I believe that we, the people, should say, long may it continue. Anyway, that's wrapped up. Please comment below about your own experiences. I'm interested to see how they might contrast or correlate to my own. Please don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying my meanderings. It does help, and we're getting very close to that 1,000 mark at the time of this recording. Also, don't forget that I have Subscribe Star if you would like to help out that little bit further. Up next on the gaming front is something of a dive into 4th edition Dungeons & Dragons, but as you may have picked up from this video essay, it's not a system I played, so we'll be looking more into why that was the case. Where do I think it failed for me? Also coming up on the gaming cards, we have Traveller, 4th edition, Mark Miller's Traveller. A look at Michael Moorcock's influence in role-playing. What I really believe when it comes to edition wars, Twilight 2000, and a deeper dive into some of my favourite published works. Until then.